Flight crew tells black pilot to move from first class, then he stuns everyone by taking charge. In a world where prejudice often wears a polite smile and discrimination hides behind corporate policies, one moment of injustice would spark an extraordinary chain of events at 35,000 feet. Marcus Anderson, a veteran pilot with 15 years of experience, boarded a flight as a first-class passenger, only to face the most humiliating experience of his career. But what happened next would shake the entire airline industry to its core. As the boundaries between dignity and discrimination blurred in the pressurized cabin, no one could have predicted how a simple act of prejudice would transform into a tale of justice, redemption, and systemic change. But the question remains, at what cost would justice finally be served? Let's stick around to find out. But before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from today. If you enjoy this tale, don't forget to subscribe. Marcus Anderson adjusted his carry-on bag, his shoulders still aching from the 16-hour rescue mission he'd just completed. After 15 years as a commercial airline pilot and countless lives saved, he'd finally decided to take his first vacation. His father's deteriorating health made the decision easier. Some things couldn't wait any longer. The familiar scent of jet fuel and coffee filled his nostrils as he boarded the aircraft. First class, seat 3A, a small luxury he'd allowed himself, knowing he needed the rest. His pilot's credentials pressed against his chest in his jacket pocket, a familiar comfort after all these years. "Good morning," he nodded to the flight attendant, Emma Parker, whose name tag caught the fluorescent lighting. Her initial professional smile froze slightly as she saw him, her eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. Marcus had seen that look before. He'd hoped things would be different in first class, but some things never changed. He found his seat and settled in, carefully storing his bag in the overhead compartment. The leather seat felt different from this side, softer, more inviting than the captain's chair he usually occupied. A small smile played across his lips as he watched other passengers board, recognizing the familiar types he'd served for years. "Excuse me, sir." Emma's voice cut through his thoughts, sharp and clinical. She held a tablet, her knuckles white against its edges. "There seems to be some confusion with your seat assignment." Marcus maintained his professional composure, developed through years of similar encounters. "No confusion," he replied calmly, pulling up his boarding pass on his phone. "Seat 3A, first class." "I'll need to verify this," Emma announced loudly, drawing attention from nearby passengers. "The system shows some irregularities." Her voice carried across the cabin, ensuring others could hear. Marcus felt the familiar weight of eyes on him, the only black person in first class. He reached for his pilot's credentials, a motion practiced countless times. "I'm actually a captain with this airline." "Sir," Emma cut him off, her voice dripping with forced politeness. "Regardless of your status, there appears to be a booking error. We'll need to move you to economy while we sort this out." She gestured to a security officer who had mysteriously appeared at her shoulder. The humiliation was calculated, public, and deliberate. Marcus watched as Emma immediately turned to a white passenger in economy. "Mr. Thompson? We've had a fortunate upgrade become available in first class. If you'd like to gather your belongings." The message couldn't have been clearer. Marcus could feel his heart pounding, years of similar indignities threatening to boil over. But his father's words echoed in his mind. "They expect anger. Show them dignity." He stood slowly, deliberately, aware of every eye in first class watching. Some passengers pretended to be absorbed in their phones, while others stared openly. A woman in 2C had the decency to look embarrassed, quickly averting her gaze. "Of course," Marcus said, his voice steady and professional. "I'll move to economy." He retrieved his bag with measured movements, careful not to make any sudden gestures that might make the security officer nervous. As he walked toward the back of the plane, he heard the whispers. Must have been a mistake. These things happen. Better safe than sorry. Each step felt like a mile, each whisper a small cut. But Marcus walked with his head high, his pilot's bearing never wavering. What Emma and the others didn't know was that this displaced passenger was actually conducting a corporate audit of crew behavior and customer service. Finding an empty middle seat in row 23, Marcus settled in, his tall frame cramped in the restricted space. He pulled out his phone, not to complain on social media or call his lawyer, but to document everything. As a recently appointed executive director conducting an undercover assessment, this incident would become more than just another example of discrimination. The irony wasn't lost on him. They'd moved one of their most senior executives to economy based on nothing but the color of his skin. But Marcus knew something Emma didn't. Sometimes justice required patience. He watched as Emma paraded the white passenger to his former seat, her triumphant smile visible even from the back of the plane. Marcus allowed himself a small, knowing smile. In his pocket, his executive ID badge pressed against his chest, right next to his pilot's credentials. Sometimes, dignity wasn't just about walking away. Sometimes, it was about waiting for the right moment to stand up. 2 hours into the flight, Marcus noticed something that most passengers wouldn't. A subtle change in the engine's pitch, barely perceptible but unmistakable to his trained ear. Years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, they were screaming that something was wrong. The cabin lights flickered once, then again. Most passengers barely looked up from their devices, but Marcus's jaw tightened. He watched as Emma Parker strode confidently through the cabin, reassuring a concerned passenger that it was just normal turbulence. It wasn't. The aircraft suddenly shuddered, more violently this time. Overhead bins rattled, and a few passengers gasped. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, maintaining a practiced calm that couldn't quite mask his concern. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some minor electrical issues. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Minor? Marcus knew better. The particular pattern of electrical failures, combined with the engine's changed pitch, suggested something far more serious. His suspicions were confirmed when the cabin lights went out completely, replaced by the dim glow of emergency lighting. Panic began to spread through the cabin. A child started crying somewhere in the front. Marcus could hear Emma's voice, higher-pitched now, attempting to maintain order. Then it happened, the unmistakable smell of electrical burning. The aircraft banked sharply to the left, and oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. Screams erupted throughout the cabin. Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt. This wasn't about pride anymore. It was about survival. He could hear the flight crew's urgent communications through the thin cockpit door. They were losing multiple systems. Sir, you need to stay seated. Emma's voice carried over the chaos as she spotted him standing. Marcus drew himself up to his full height. I'm Captain Marcus Anderson, and this aircraft is experiencing a cascading electrical failure that could affect the hydraulic systems. I need to speak with the flight crew immediately. Emma's face, illuminated by the emergency lights, showed recognition, not of him as the passenger she'd humiliated, but of the authority in his voice. For a moment, she hesitated. The autopilot's failing. The shout from the cockpit made the decision for her. Marcus moved swiftly to the front, his mind already running through emergency procedures. Inside the cockpit, he found Captain Stevens and First Officer Zhang battling with failing systems. Electrical fire in the main bus, Stevens reported tersely. We're losing control surfaces. Switch to backup power and isolate the main electrical system, Marcus commanded, falling naturally into his role. I've seen this before on the 787s. There's a bypass procedure. The next 10 minutes were a blur of technical expertise and precise coordination. Marcus guided them through a complex series of procedures, his calm voice a stark contrast to the chaos in the passenger cabin. His intimate knowledge of the aircraft's systems proved invaluable as they worked to restore critical functions. Through it all, he could feel Emma watching from the cockpit doorway, her earlier arrogance replaced by something else, realization, perhaps, or shame. Finally, the aircraft stabilized. The primary systems came back online, and the immediate danger passed. Captain Stevens let out a long breath. We need to divert to the nearest airport. We've lost too many backup systems to continue. Marcus nodded, already calculating fuel reserves and weather patterns. With his help, they plotted a course to the nearest suitable airport. As he stepped back into the cabin, the passengers burst into spontaneous applause. Word of his intervention had spread quickly. He saw faces filled with gratitude and relief, the same faces that had earlier watched his humiliation in silence. Emma stood near his row, her complexion pale. Captain Anderson, I? But Marcus walked past her without acknowledgement, returning to his middle seat in economy. He pulled out his phone again, adding to his earlier notes. The incident would make an interesting addition to his report, not just about discrimination, but about safety protocols and crew training as well. As the aircraft began its descent, Marcus felt no triumph, no satisfaction in Emma's discomfort. His thoughts were only of his father, waiting in a hospital bed, and of the changes this flight would bring to an industry he dedicated his life to. Sometimes, he reflected, the most powerful response to prejudice wasn't confrontation or revenge, but simple, undeniable competence. And sometimes, the best way to change minds wasn't through words, but through actions that left no room for doubt. The aircraft banked gently toward its emergency landing, and Marcus Anderson, executive director of operations, prepared himself for the storm that would follow. But for now, he was simply a pilot who had done his job, keeping everyone safe, regardless of how they had treated him. The emergency landing made national headlines, but not for the reasons anyone expected. Within hours of touchdown, a passenger's video of Emma Parker's discriminatory behavior went viral. The clip, showing her deliberately humiliating Marcus and upgrading a white passenger to his seat, spread across social media like wildfire. Racism at 35,000 feet. Senior airline executive faces discrimination, then saves flight. The headlines were relentless. Major news networks picked up the story, playing the damning footage on repeat. Emma's face became the symbol of casual racism in corporate America, her smirk as she moved Marcus to economy class frozen in time for millions to see. In the airline's corporate headquarters, an emergency board meeting was called. Marcus sat quietly as the video played on the boardroom's large screen, his detailed report open in front of each board member. The silence that followed was deafening. This is beyond unacceptable, the CEO finally spoke, his face ashen. Captain Anderson, as our executive director of operations, what do you recommend? Marcus leaned forward. This isn't about one flight attendant. This is about systemic issues that need addressing. However, Ms. Parker's actions require immediate action. The internal investigation was swift and thorough. Multiple passengers came forward with statements, describing not only Emma's discriminatory behavior, but also Marcus's subsequent heroic actions during the crisis. She didn't even look at his credentials, one first-class passenger reported. She just assumed he didn't belong there. The airline's PR team worked overtime, drafting a public statement that would appear in major newspapers and media outlets. Southwest Airlines announces the immediate termination of flight attendant Emma Parker following a thorough investigation into discriminatory conduct. We apologize unreservedly to Executive Director Marcus Anderson and reaffirm our zero-tolerance policy toward discrimination of any kind. Emma's fall from grace was spectacular. As the story gained traction, other incidents from her past emerged. Former colleagues spoke out about previous discriminatory behavior that had gone unreported. Her professional reputation was in tatters. The final blow came when civil rights organizations announced their intention to file a lawsuit. Emma found herself not only jobless but facing serious legal consequences. Her attempts to apologize through her lawyer were met with silence from both the airline and Marcus. At a press conference called by the airline, Marcus finally spoke publicly about the incident. Cameras flashed as he took the podium, his presence commanding respect. "What happened on that flight reflects a broader issue in our society," he began, his voice steady. "But today, we're taking steps to ensure it never happens again. I'm announcing a comprehensive overhaul of our training programs and hiring practices." The reporters hung on every word as Marcus outlined the airline's new initiatives. But it was his closing statement that made headlines. "To those who face discrimination daily, your dignity is your power. To those who discriminate, justice may not always be swift, but it will be served." In the weeks that followed, Emma Parker became a cautionary tale in corporate training sessions across the country. Her name became synonymous with the consequences of unchecked bias and discrimination. She was last seen leaving a courthouse after a preliminary hearing, her once proud demeanor replaced by defeated resignation. The airline industry watched closely as Southwest implemented its new policies. Other carriers rushed to review their own procedures, fearful of similar incidents. The ripple effect spread far beyond one flight, one airline, or one incident of discrimination. Marcus received hundreds of letters from people sharing their own experiences with discrimination. Many thanked him for standing up, for showing that justice was possible. But he took no pleasure in Emma's downfall. For him, this had never been about revenge. It was about change. As he sat in his new corner office, reviewing applications for the airline's expanded diversity initiative, Marcus reflected on how a single flight had catalyzed such significant change. The photo on his desk showed him with his father in the hospital, taken just days after the incident. His father's proud smile said everything that needed to be said. Sometimes, justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about transformation. And in this case, justice had been served not just to one person, but to an entire system that needed to change. 1 month after the incident, the Southwest Airlines boardroom buzzed with anticipation. The CEO stood at the head of the table, addressing a room full of executives and press representatives. "Today marks a new chapter in our airline's history," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of the moment. "I am proud to announce the promotion of Marcus Anderson to Senior Executive Vice President of Operations and Corporate Culture." The applause was genuine, not the polite corporate kind. Marcus rose from his seat, straightening his tie, the same one he'd worn on that fateful flight. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who had been deemed unworthy of a first-class seat was now one of the most powerful figures in commercial aviation. Leadership isn't just about making the right decisions, Marcus began his acceptance speech. It's about transforming challenges into opportunities for change. What happened on that flight wasn't just about one incident of discrimination. It was a wake-up call for our entire industry. Under Marcus's leadership, Southwest implemented groundbreaking changes. The new Diversity and Equality Initiative became a model for other airlines. Training programs were overhauled, hiring practices reformed, and a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination was enforced with unprecedented rigor. Industry publications praised the transformation. Southwest sets new standards for corporate culture, read one headline. "From crisis to change, how one man's dignity transformed an airline," declared another. But Marcus's influence extended beyond corporate policies. He became a sought-after speaker at industry conferences, sharing his story not as a tale of personal triumph, but as a catalyst for systemic change. His message was clear. Excellence knows no color, and dignity transcends discrimination. In his new office, overlooking the airport runways, Marcus kept a framed photo from that challenging flight, a reminder of where this journey began. Next to it sat a letter from a young black aviation student. Your story showed me that we don't just belong in the sky. We can soar above expectations. The airline statistics told the story of change. Diversity in hiring increased by 300%, employee satisfaction reached record highs, and customer feedback reflected a new culture of inclusivity and respect. During his final address at the annual Airline Industry Conference, Marcus shared the philosophy that had guided him through that difficult day and beyond. True victory isn't in proving others wrong. It's in proving yourself right. It's not about rising to power, but about rising above prejudice. And most importantly, it's about ensuring that the door you walk through remains open for others to follow. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for Marcus. It was for every person who had ever faced discrimination and chosen dignity over despair, excellence over anger. As he left the podium, Marcus thought about his father's words from years ago. Son, sometimes you have to fly through turbulence to reach clear skies. The turbulence of that day had indeed led to clearer skies, not just for him, but for an entire industry. The story of Flight 2857 would be told in training rooms and boardrooms for years to come. But its lasting legacy wasn't in the headlines or policy changes. It was in the subtle shift in how people treated each other, in the understanding that true merit transcends prejudice, and in the knowledge that justice, when served with dignity, can transform more than just one moment or one life. It was proof that sometimes, the highest way to rise above discrimination is to use it as a foundation for change that lifts everyone higher.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.